People remember how someone behaves in a crisis. They remember the tears, the anger, the collapse. What they don't always remember, at least not right away, is what doesn't happen. The absence of reaction, the silence where emotion should be, the moment when grief stops looking like grief at all. At Eliza Carter's funeral, Victor Hale stood exactly where he was supposed to stand. Beside his wife. Near the front. Close enough to be seen. To anyone watching from a distance, he looked like a grieving stepfather. But Naomi noticed something that day she couldn't explain and wouldn't fully understand until much later. Victor was present, but he wasn't there. He didn't reach for Naomi when her legs shook. He didn't whisper reassurances. He didn't cling to the moment the way people usually do when they're terrified of letting go. He stood upright still, controlled, as if the service were something to endure rather than something to survive. There's a particular kind of grief that feels messy. It leaks out. It disrupts. It embarrasses people. Victor's grief didn't do any of that. It stayed contained. When people approached him, he thanked them. When condolences were offered, he nodded. When Eliza's name was spoken, he didn't correct the tense. He didn't flinch. Naomi noticed something else too. Victor never once looked at the casket. Not during the service. Not during the prayers. Not when it was lowered into the ground. It was as if acknowledging it would require believing something he had already accepted, or perhaps something he never questioned at all. At the time, Naomi told herself not to judge. Everyone grieves differently. She had heard that sentence so many times it felt rehearsed. So she held on to it. In the days after the funeral, Naomi's world shrank. Time lost its shape. Her body moved on instinct alone. Grief followed her into every room. Victor, meanwhile, began to change. He stopped sitting with her at night. Stopped asking how she was sleeping. Stopped talking about Eliza altogether. At first, Naomi assumed it was pain. Avoidance. Shock. But then the distance widened. Victor stayed out late. Sometimes he didn't come home. When Naomi asked where he had been, his answers were brief and unspecific. Out. Driving. I needed air. Always calm. Always controlled. Never detailed. He stopped participating in mourning. Didn't look through photos. Didn't attend support meetings. Didn't acknowledge anniversaries. It was as if grief had an expiration date, and his had arrived early. Friends noticed it too. They whispered about how strong he was, how put together, how he seemed to be handling it well. Naomi nodded when they said it. But inside something twisted, because strength doesn't usually look like detachment, and healing doesn't usually involve erasure. Victor stopped saying Eliza's name. Not deliberately. Not dramatically. He just removed it from his vocabulary. When Naomi brought Eliza up, Victor changed the subject. When she cried, he waited for it to pass. When she asked questions about the night on the ship, he ended the conversation. There's nothing more to say, he told her. And the finality in his voice frightened her. It wasn't anger. It wasn't grief. It was closure, arrived at too quickly. Naomi tried to reach him emotionally. She asked him to talk. She asked him to sit with her. She asked him to remember. Victor listened politely. Then he disengaged. There was no argument. No explosion. Just a gradual withdrawal that felt calculated in its calmness. Weeks passed. And then Victor did something Naomi wasn't prepared for. He began organizing. He sorted documents. Made copies. cleared out old files. At first, Naomi thought it was practical, two people drowning in grief trying to regain control over something. But Victor wasn't just organizing. He was preparing. He moved through the house with purpose, not like someone struggling to survive a loss, but like someone completing a process. One evening, Naomi asked him a question she had been holding in for weeks. Do you think she could still be alive? Victor didn't hesitate. No. The answer came too fast. Too certain. Naomi felt the room tilt. Not because of what he said, but because of how easily he said it. No pause. No uncertainty. No hesitation. Just an ending. That was the moment Naomi realized something fundamental had shifted. Victor wasn't grieving alongside her. He had already moved on. And people don't move on from tragedy that fast unless they believe the story is finished. Or unless they know something others don't. A few days later, Victor slept on the couch. He didn't explain why. He didn't argue when Naomi asked. He just said, I need space. Space turned into silence. Silence turned into distance. And distance began to feel permanent. Naomi would later replay those weeks again and again. Not looking for a smoking gun. Just trying to understand how someone could exit grief so cleanly. So efficiently. So completely. Victor Hale had stood beside her at the funeral. But somewhere between the burial and the weeks that followed, he had already left. And Naomi was just beginning to realize that the man who disappeared after Eliza had started disappearing long before. Most marriages don't end suddenly. They fracture. They argue. They unravel in pieces. This one didn't. Victor Hale didn't leave in a moment of rage. He didn't pack bags after a fight. He didn't threaten to go and then stay. He simply decided. And once that decision was made, everything else followed with unsettling efficiency. 3 weeks after Eliza Carter's funeral, Victor told Naomi he wanted a divorce. Not during an argument. Not during a breakdown. On an ordinary afternoon, in an ordinary room, with a voice so calm it almost sounded rehearsed. I can't do this anymore, he said. No explanation. Just a conclusion. Naomi didn't understand what this meant. Grief. Marriage. Life after loss. She asked him to clarify. Victor didn't. He told her he'd already spoken to a lawyer. That the paperwork was mostly done. That it would be easier if they didn't drag things out. Easier. That word landed hard. Naomi suggested counseling. Victor declined. She asked for time. Victor said time wouldn't change anything. She asked him if Eliza had anything to do with his decision. Victor didn't answer right away. Then he said, we're just hurting each other now. It was the only emotional sentence he would offer. Within days, Victor moved out. Not dramatically. Not angrily. He packed carefully. Clothes folded. Documents sorted. Personal items removed with precision. He didn't take photos. Not of Naomi. Not of Eliza. Naomi watched from the doorway, frozen. It felt less like abandonment and more like erasure. The divorce papers arrived shortly after. They were clean, organized, pre-prepared. Victor had thought this through. There were no custody disputes. No shared children to negotiate. No assets fought over aggressively. Victor didn't ask for much, which somehow made it worse. Friends tried to rationalize it. People can't survive this kind of loss. Grief breaks marriages all the time. Maybe he just couldn't cope. Naomi repeated those explanations aloud, but inside they didn't fit. Victor didn't look broken. He looked finished. He stopped returning Naomi's calls once the paperwork was filed, stopped responding to messages. Communication became strictly legal. Brief, impersonal, controlled. Naomi tried to talk about Eliza one last time. She asked Victor if he ever thought about the night on the ship, if he replayed it, if he had questions. Victor replied with a single sentence. There's no point. No point. As if the mystery had already been solved. When the divorce was finalized, Victor didn't attend the final meeting in person. His lawyer appeared instead. The marriage ended without confrontation, without closure, without acknowledgement of what had been lost. And then Victor disappeared. His phone number was disconnected. His email account stopped responding. Even mutual friends couldn't say where he was. Some thought he'd moved. Others assumed he needed a fresh start. No one seemed concerned by how thoroughly he'd vanished. Naomi was. She tried to track him down, not out of anger but out of confusion. She needed answers. She needed to understand how someone could walk away from grief so cleanly. But Victor had left no forwarding address. No trail. No goodbye. The man who had stood beside her at the funeral was gone. Not slowly. Not painfully. But completely. And for the first time since Eliza disappeared, Naomi felt a new fear surface. Not the fear of loss, but the fear that something had been hidden from her all along. Because people leave relationships for many reasons, but they don't usually erase themselves unless they're trying to outrun something. And Victor Hale wasn't just running from grief. He was running from a past he didn't want revisited. Naomi didn't have proof. She didn't have accusations. She only had instinct. And instinct told her this wasn't a man escaping pain. This was a man escaping scrutiny. But instinct, she would learn, isn't evidence. And without evidence, questions stay questions. Victor Hale had severed every tie. Legal, emotional, personal. And just like that, he was gone. Disappearances don't happen all at once. They happen in layers. A person leaves. Then the traces thin. Then the questions stop being asked. And somewhere in that quiet space between absence and indifference, the truth is allowed to fade. After Victor Hale vanished from Naomi's life, she expected the questions to begin. She expected investigators to notice, to ask why a man connected to a disappearance had severed every tie so quickly, to wonder why grief had turned into escape. But the questions never came. At first, Naomi assumed that meant answers already existed, that someone somewhere had checked. She was wrong. The first irregularity appeared in the bank statements. Naomi hadn't looked closely at their finances during the weeks after Eliza disappeared. Grief had consumed everything else. But when the divorce paperwork arrived, she went back through old records, slowly, painfully, trying to understand what had changed. That's when she saw it. Withdrawals she didn't recognize. Transfers she couldn't explain. Movements that didn't align with household expenses. They weren't massive sums. That was the problem. They were precise, measured, easy to overlook unless someone was looking closely. Some transfers occurred shortly after the cruise ended. Others appeared in the weeks following Eliza's disappearance. Victor had always handled finances. Naomi had trusted him too. Now she wondered why. She brought the discrepancies to the attention of authorities. She didn't accuse. She asked questions. The response was polite, non-committal, Financial activity alone, she was told, didn't indicate wrongdoing. There was no indication of fraud. No immediate connection to the disappearance. The matter wasn't pursued. Next came the phone records. Victor's phone history, what little Naomi could access, showed calls that didn't make sense. International numbers, late hours, repeated contact with the same unknown lines. Some calls were placed shortly after Eliza vanished. Others followed during the days when the search was still active. Naomi asked if the calls had been traced. She was told they hadn't. Why? Because there was no evidence they were relevant. This is how trails go cold. Not because information disappears, but because it's declared unimportant. Victor's movements after the cruise were equally unclear. He took time off work without explanation, canceled standing commitments, became unreachable during hours he was usually available. His employer later confirmed he resigned abruptly. No farewell gathering. No notice period. Just gone. Naomi tried to report these changes. She was told Victor was an adult. He was allowed to leave. Allowed to start over. Allowed to grieve however he chose. What Naomi heard was something else. Stop looking. No subpoenas were issued. No financial analysis conducted. No digital trail reconstructed. Victor's life before and after the cruise remained fragmented, untouched by investigation. It wasn't that authorities missed the clues. It was that they never connected them. Each irregularity was treated in isolation. A withdrawal here. A phone call there. A sudden move. None alarming on their own. Together they formed a pattern. But patterns only matter if someone is willing to acknowledge them. Naomi began keeping records herself. Notes, dates, printouts. She didn't know what she was looking for. Only that she couldn't shake the feeling that Victor's disappearance wasn't grief-driven. It was strategic. When she tried to reopen conversations with investigators, she was met with sympathy, but no action. The case had been reviewed. The findings remained unchanged. Without new evidence, there was nothing to pursue. New evidence. The phrase echoed in Naomi's mind. Because the evidence had never been examined to begin with. This is where many stories end. A family exhausts their energy. Authorities close ranks. Time does the rest. But Naomi couldn't let go. Because the trail wasn't cold. It had simply been abandoned. Victor Hale didn't disappear randomly. He didn't drift away slowly. He dismantled his life in pieces and left behind just enough normalcy to avoid attention. And the people responsible for looking closer didn't. Years would pass. The records would age. Memories would dull. And Victor's absence would be reclassified as coincidence. But Naomi would remember the details. The timing. The silence. The way no one seemed interested in asking why. Because when the wrong assumptions are made early, they calcify. And by the time someone realizes a mistake has been made, the truth is already buried under paperwork. Victor Hale had left a trail. It just wasn't followed. People disappear every day. They change cities, change jobs, change names. Most of the time, someone notices. Victor Hale made sure no one did. After the divorce was finalized, Victor didn't just move on. He dismantled. His social media accounts vanished first. Not deleted dramatically, no farewell posts, no explanations. They simply went dark. Friends who searched for him later would find nothing. No profile photos. No old posts. No digital footprint. as if he had never existed online at all. His email address followed. Then his phone number. Disconnected. Unreachable. Naomi tried once more to contact him, not to confront, but to understand. The message bounced back. Victor closed his bank accounts within weeks. Not emptied recklessly. Transferred. Redirected. Clean. Accounts Naomi didn't recognize appeared briefly in the records, then disappeared too. By the time anyone thought to look again, there was nothing left to examine. He terminated his lease early. No forwarding address. No listed destination. Neighbors later told Naomi they hadn't even known he was leaving until the apartment was empty. Victor didn't announce his departure. He executed it. His employer confirmed he resigned without explanation. No new job listed. No references requested. Just a resignation letter and a final paycheck. For a man who had once been predictable, routine-driven, organized, cautious, this level of disappearance felt deliberate. Because accidents leave chaos. Planning leaves order. Naomi began to realize something chilling. Victor hadn't fled. He had transitioned. Every trace he removed made it harder for anyone to ask questions later. Every account closed meant fewer records. Every relationship severed meant fewer people to notice inconsistencies. She contacted mutual friends. Most hadn't heard from him. A few claimed they had, but couldn't say when or where. Stories didn't align. Details didn't match. Victor's presence in the world had become theoretical. Naomi brought this to authorities. Again, she explained that Victor had effectively erased himself. That his disappearance coincided too neatly with Eliza. That it didn't feel like grief, it felt like escape. The response was familiar. Victor was an adult. Adults are allowed to disappear. Unless a crime could be proven, there was nothing to pursue. Nothing to pursue. As if absence itself wasn't evidence of intent. Naomi stopped expecting help. She started documenting instead. Because something about Victor's erasure didn't just feel suspicious. It felt rehearsed. He knew which records mattered. Which ones didn't. Which traces would raise questions, and which would blend into background noise. Victor hadn't panicked. He hadn't scrambled. He had executed a clean exit. And clean exits don't happen without preparation. Years passed. Victor Hale became a name people stopped recognizing. A face no one could picture clearly anymore. Time did what time always does. It softened urgency. But Naomi didn't forget. Because every unanswered question pointed back to the same reality. Victor didn't vanish because he wanted peace. He vanished because he wanted distance. From grief. From scrutiny. From the past. And people who erase themselves rarely do so unless they believe the past might eventually catch up. Victor Hale had removed himself from Naomi's life. From Eliza's story. From official records. But he hadn't removed himself from suspicion. Not entirely. Because somewhere, far from the cruise ship, far from the funeral, far from the marriage he dissolved, Victor Hale was still living. Still moving. Still leaving footprints. And one day, someone would stumble across them. Time has a way of convincing people that the past is settled. That unanswered questions are just unanswered because they were never meant to be answered. For Naomi, time did the opposite. It sharpened everything. By 2023, nearly a decade had passed since Eliza vanished at sea. The world had moved on. The case had not. Naomi no longer spoke publicly about Victor Hale. Not because she had stopped thinking about him, but because saying his name out loud felt pointless. There was nothing new. No updates. No leads. Victor existed only as a memory attached to a tragedy no one wanted to reopen. Until a vacation changed that. It was Naomi's vacation. It belonged to someone else entirely. A woman named Rachel. Rachel had no connection to Eliza. No connection to Naomi. No reason to care about a cruise ship disappearance from years earlier. She was just traveling. In the spring of 2023, Rachel and her husband booked a trip abroad, one of those quiet, midlife vacations meant to reset routines and escape stress. A coastal town. Small hotels. Slow mornings. The kind of place where nothing ever happens. On the third day of the trip, Rachel noticed him. Not because he stood out, but because he didn't. He was sitting alone at the hotel bar. Mid-50s. Reserved. Polite. American accent. He made small talk with staff, but avoided deeper conversation. Paid in cash. Stayed longer than most guests. Rachel didn't think twice about him. Until she heard his name. A hotel clerk called out to him as he stood to leave. "Good night, Victor." Something in Rachel's chest tightened. Not fear. Recognition. Years earlier, Rachel had watched a documentary late one night. One of those true crime stories you stumble into and forget you're watching until hours have passed. A teenage girl. A cruise ship. A disappearance. A stepfather who vanished afterward. She hadn't remembered many details, but she remembered the name. Victor. At first, she dismissed the thought. Victor isn't an uncommon name. Coincidences happen. But the next morning, she saw him again. Same routine. Same seat. Same distance from everyone else. She paid closer attention this time. Listened. Observed. He spoke about traveling alone. About having no family. About liking places where no one asks questions. That night, Rachel did something she hadn't planned to do. She searched. She typed a name into her phone. Then added a few keywords. Cruise. Disappearance. Stepfather. And there it was. An old article. A face. A story she had nearly forgotten. The man in the photo looked older. Thinner. But unmistakable. Victor Hale. Rachel's heart pounded. Not because she knew what it meant, but because she knew what it could mean. She didn't confront him. Didn't speak to him. Didn't let on that she recognized anything. Instead, she did something far more important. She documented. Photos. Dates. Locations. The hotel name. The bar. The timestamps. She watched Victor leave the property that evening. Watched him walk down the street. Disappear into the dark. Rachel returned home with the memory burning in her mind. She debated what to do. Told herself it wasn't her responsibility. That she could be wrong. That reopening old wounds might do more harm than good. But she couldn't shake one thought. Victor Hale wasn't gone. He was just hiding in plain sight. Weeks later, Naomi received an email she almost deleted. The subject line read, "I think I saw him." At first, Naomi assumed it was another cruel coincidence. Another mistaken sighting. Another well-meaning stranger reopening old pain. But then she opened the attachment and saw the photo. Older, thinner, but unmistakable. Victor Hale. Alive. Traveling. Free. Naomi stared at the screen, breath shallow. Because for the first time in years, the past had a location. Victor hadn't disappeared. He hadn't erased himself completely. He had simply moved far enough away to believe no one would ever connect the dots. But someone had. And now Naomi had proof. Not of guilt, not of a crime, but of something just as dangerous. Victor Hale had lied. He had let the world believe he was gone. Let grief turn into silence. Let questions die unanswered. And now, after all these years, the silence was broken.